The Scramble for Africa, a continent carved apart. In the heart of the 19th century, a storm was brewing, one that would reshape an entire continent. The great empires of Europe, hungry for power and wealth, set their sights on Africa, a land of untamed beauty, ancient civilizations, and boundless resources. What began as a trickle of explorers soon became a flood of soldiers, merchants, and politicians, all racing to stake their claim in a ruthless game of conquest. In 1870, Africa stood largely independent, with only 10% of its land under foreign control. But by 1914, the map had been redrawn in the halls of European capitals. 90% of the continent now belonged to outsiders. Only Ethiopia and Liberia stood defiant, unbroken. The rest had been swallowed whole by empires that saw Africa not as a home to millions, but as a prize to be seized. The seeds of conquest. It all began with whispers, stories carried back by explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley, who ventured deep into the unknown, revealing lands rich in gold, ivory, and fertile soil. But these were not mere discoveries, they were invitations. With every river mapped and every mountain charted, Europe's hunger grew. The industrial powers saw opportunity, railroads to build, mines to dig, wealth to extract. And they held a weapon Africa could not match: technology. The conquest accelerated. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened, a gateway that cut through Egypt like a dagger, giving Britain and France control over a critical lifeline of trade. A decade later, in 1879, British forces crushed the mighty Zulu Kingdom, proving that no African power, no matter how fierce, could withstand the firepower of European armies. One by one, the dominoes fell, as treaties were signed under duress and resistance was met with unrelenting force. The scramble had begun. The fate of an entire continent hung in the balance, and the cost of Europe's hunger would be paid in blood, land, and history itself. The scramble begins, a continent up for grabs. The 1880s marked the turning point. What had once been a slow encroachment exploded into a ruthless, high-stakes land grab. France and Italy tightened their grip on Senegal, Tunisia, and Eritrea, while in 1882, Great Britain marched into Egypt, determined to protect its financial interests and the all-important Suez Canal. The age of European conquest in Africa had shifted from cautious expansion to an all-out race for domination. A king's obsession, a continent's doom. If there was one man who embodied the insatiable greed of the scramble, it was King Leopold II of Belgium. Unlike other monarchs, who relied on governments and armies, Leopold operated in the shadows. Posing as a benevolent ruler interested in civilizing Africa, he orchestrated a web of deceit, using the International Association of the Congo to negotiate secret treaties with 450 local rulers. By 1884, he had secured an empire deep in the heart of Africa, not for Belgium, but for himself. What he called the Congo Free State would soon become a vast, brutal extraction machine, soaking the land in blood and suffering. But Leopold was not the only one with his sights set on Africa. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had been watching closely. He had already seized Togo, Cameroon, and Pequena in 1884, and he knew that unless Europe set rules for this violent game, chaos would erupt. So he called for a meeting, the Berlin Conference, a gathering that would decide the fate of millions. The Berlin Conference, a ruthless divide. From November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885, representatives from 14 countries sat around polished tables in Berlin, carving up Africa with maps and rulers. Not a single African voice was heard. They spoke of effective occupation and spheres of influence, masking their ambitions behind legal jargon. But the truth was clear. This was a feeding frenzy. They formalized Leopold's control over the Congo in exchange for promises of free trade, promises that would be ignored. They declared the Niger and Congo rivers open for commerce, but it was the chains of imperialism that would flow freely, not trade. When the ink dried on the General Act of the Berlin Conference, Europe had given itself the green light for unfettered conquest. On paper, it seemed diplomatic, even civilized. In reality, it was nothing more than a cover for raw greed. The coming years would bring unimaginable brutality. as European powers raced to claim every inch of the continent, drawing borders that would shape Africa's future, for better or, more often, for worse. The scramble had become a stampede, and Africa would never be the same. The greed, the glory, the justifications. Why Europe rushed to carve up Africa. With the ink barely dry on the Berlin Conference agreements, the European powers surged forward in a race for conquest, driven by forces far deeper than mere diplomacy. The scramble for Africa was not just about territory, it was about power, wealth, and the dangerous illusions of superiority that justified it all. A race against time and each other. No empire could afford to hesitate. The fear was palpable. If Britain did not seize a region, France would. If Germany held back, Belgium or Portugal would swoop in. This was not just about expansion. It was about survival in the ruthless arena of global power. For newly unified nations like Germany and Italy, colonial conquest was a way to prove their place among the great powers, to declare to the world that they belonged in the elite club of empires. Nationalism and imperial ambition were two sides of the same coin, and neither could afford to lose. The profits of empire, or the illusion of them. Beneath the patriotic slogans and grand speeches, the truth was far simpler. Africa was a gold mine, sometimes literally. King Leopold II had already demonstrated the horrifying profitability of empire, turning the Congo into his personal slave camp to extract rubber and ivory. Other European leaders watched, calculating how they too could turn African land, labor, and resources into wealth. Industrialized Europe craved raw materials, gold, diamonds, palm oil, rubber, resources that could be refined and sold at immense profit. But there was a dark irony to the economic promise of empire. While monopolists and corporations reaped the benefits, entire colonial governments struggled to make their ventures pay off. The costs of maintaining an overseas empire often outweighed the economic returns, but that did not matter. What mattered was prestige, dominance, and control. A dangerous justification, the civilizing mission. If greed was the engine, ideology was the fuel. Europe did not just want Africa's land and riches. It wanted to believe it had a moral right to take them. The so-called civilizing mission gave European expansion an air of righteousness, painting conquest as a duty rather than an act of raw aggression. Social Darwinism, the twisted belief that certain races were inherently superior, became a rallying cry. The scramble was cast as a noble endeavor, a way to uplift barbaric societies by forcing them into European ways of life. Missionaries spoke of Christianizing the heathens, while reformers declared Africa a battleground against the slave trade, ignoring that European nations had profited from that very trade for centuries. But perhaps the most grotesque display of Europe's self-congratulatory arrogance was the so-called human zoos. Across Europe, African men, women, and children were exhibited in cages, displayed like exotic animals for gawking crowds. These spectacles reinforced the lie of European superiority, feeding the dangerous myth that imperial rule was a gift rather than a theft. Literature, too, played its part. Rudyard Kipling's infamous poem, The White Man's Burden, framed colonization as a thankless task, a burden placed upon the enlightened to save the savage. A justification for greed, a cover for brutality. What began as a geopolitical chess game quickly became something far worse, a relentless campaign of subjugation, built on the intertwined desires for wealth, dominance, and a belief in racial hierarchy. The scramble for Africa was not just an era of expansion, it was an era of devastation, one that would shape the continent's history in ways still felt today. Europe had convinced itself that it was bringing civilization to Africa, but history would prove that it was Africa that would suffer for Europe's greed. The lasting scars, the effects and legacy of the scramble for Africa. The scramble for Africa did not end with the drawing of borders. It set off a chain reaction that reshaped global politics and left a deep, lasting wound on the African continent. A continent carved and contested. The reckless division of Africa by European powers fueled international tensions that nearly ignited war between empires. The Fashoda Crisis, 1898, brought Britain and France to the brink of conflict in Sudan, forcing them into an uneasy alliance that later became the Entente Cordiale 1904, a key step toward the alliances that would define World War I Germany. Eager to disrupt this power balance, triggered the Moroccan crises, 1905, 06, 1911, heightening tensions between itself, Britain, and France. Meanwhile, Britain faced its own brutal conflicts in Africa. The South African War, 1899 to 1902, fought against the Dutch-descended Boer settlers, ended with Britain tightening its grip on the mineral-rich southern regions. Each of these conflicts, though fought on African soil, was merely a proxy for European rivalries, battles fought not for Africa, but for imperial dominance. The human cost, a legacy of suffering. For the African people, the scramble was nothing short of catastrophic. The European empires ruled through exploitation and violence, treating Africa as a resource to be drained rather than a home to be respected. In Leopold's Congo Free State, the rubber industry became a death sentence. An estimated half the population, millions of people, perished under forced labor, executions, and starvation. The atrocities were so extreme that even other colonial powers were horrified, forcing Belgium to take control in 1908. In German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, between 1904 and 1907, the German military carried out the first genocide of the 20th century, slaughtering and starving the Herero and Nama peoples in a ruthless campaign of extermination. Borders that never belonged. The scramble did not just steal lives. It tore apart nations before they had the chance to form. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers forced together ethnic groups with deep rivalries while splitting apart those with shared histories. When African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, they inherited these fractured, artificial borders, leading to internal divisions, civil wars, and struggles for stability that continue to this day. Colonization also left an enduring imprint on African governance, economy, and culture. Indigenous languages and traditions were erased or suppressed, replaced by the languages of the colonizers, English, French, and Portuguese. African economies were built to serve European interests, focusing on resource extraction rather than self-sustaining industries. Many nations still grapple with economic structures designed for colonial exploitation rather than domestic prosperity. A wound that time cannot heal. More than a century after the Berlin Conference, Africa is still living with the consequences of its past. The scramble for Africa was not just a historical event. It was a violent disruption, a theft of sovereignty, culture, and identity that continues to shape the present. The ghosts of imperial ambition linger in economic struggles, political instability, and the unresolved scars of colonial rule. The scramble may have ended on paper, but its impact endures in every border drawn, every resource plundered, and every life lost. Africa was never meant to be a chessboard for European empires, but that is what it became, and history has not forgotten.